Future Dams is a research consortium. It's a research project funded by the Research Challenges UK as a part of the Global Challenges Research Fund. The program is led by the University of Manchester here at the Global Development Institute and the International Institute for Environment and Development. And it's a consortium of over 30 research bodies, and we run until next December. And broadly, to classify our goals, we're working to improve the planning and governance of water, energy, food, environment systems. And we're working with institutional and case studies partners to develop the knowledge-based tools and approach to enable resilient and sustainable development. And among other things, one of our initiatives has been the Future Dams Lecture Series, where we host people broadly working in the food, energy, water nexus, work in several parts of the world. And Sarah was due to come to Manchester, pay us a visit, and present her research, but due to obvious reasons, we've had to move this online. So we're learning this whole Zoom configuration as we go. So if anything goes wrong in the middle of this, please bear with us, but hopefully nothing will. So to introduce Sarah, Sarah's worked in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa for a couple of decades now, advising a series of governmental, multilateral, academic, and non-governmental bodies. She's an honorary fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Edinburgh and has taught African politics and social theory in both Scotland and Ethiopia. Her research and consulting experience, her publications cover a broad range of factors. I'm not going to go into all of them, but today she's going to talk to us about the resettlement of Gumuz communities around the Blue Nile Dam. So I'll hand it over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rashnan. This is all very exciting and new. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. I hope that you can see the PowerPoint that I'm sharing on screen. It'll be made available online later on, and I believe the video of the presentation will also go online. So don't panic if you have to go off, or indeed if you just get bored halfway through. Then there'll be some questions afterwards, and I think Rashnan can explain how we're going to deal with that. Maybe people raising their hands if they want to speak is usually the way that works best in my experience. This is my first Zoom webinar, so forgive me for any glitches along the way. So it's my pleasure to present some of the research which I did in 2018 and 19, looking at the resettlement of Gumuz communities around Ethiopia's Blue Nile Dam, which was financed under the Future Dams Global Challenge Fund with close collaboration, a lot of support from Tom Lavers, in particular at the University of Manchester. Forgive me, I can't see who's online at the moment, but I think once I stop presenting, I'll be able to see whether you're there or not if I mention you by name. So this is going to be a presentation which just introduces briefly the research that we did on the research team. I'm one member of a team of 2 authors and 3 researchers. I'll briefly recap what happened with resettlement in Ethiopia for those of you who are not specialists. I'm going to look very briefly at the relationship of the Gumuz, which is the community that live along the Blue Nile Gorge in the lowland areas adjacent to the river, and the relationship that they've had with the Ethiopian state and their position of marginality on the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. I'm then briefly going to introduce the GERD resettlement package. This was a package which was specifically run by the federal government in support of the GERD, so the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So it's different from any other resettlement programs which are going on in the country at the moment. And then briefly, I want to introduce 5 groups of findings. And those of you who are familiar with Alula Pankhurst's fantastic work on resettlement and moving people in Ethiopia will probably recognize these categories. We haven't come up with anything new. In fact, I think what we're suggesting is that many of the problems and patterns of problems of the past, including access to resources and services, issues around land, property, and proper compensation for settlers, the question of conceptualizing new livelihoods that they might take on, issues around community cohesion and stability and sustainability, and then a whole series of questions around sequencing planning and the credibility of the resettlement program are common to many other initiatives, and they're certainly common to this program. And then I have a slide briefly pointing to some of the questions which I think really need to be taken into consideration by policymakers in the future if this is to be as inclusive and sustainable as everyone would like it to be. So I think it's important to say at the outset that I'm not going to talk about the geopolitics of the Nile. This is the red triangle on your screen indicates where I'm talking about in the overall Nile Basin River. It's basically the area between the Sudanese border and the dam and the confluence of the Belus River, which goes off to the east and north, and the Dabus River, which comes in from the south. And those areas are in turn going to be flooded to form the new reservoir behind the GERD. Many of you will be aware that there's a lot of controversy at the moment associated with negotiations about the filling of the dam and a lot of toing and froing involving Egypt and the Americans, but I'm not going to get into that today. These are my two co-investigators. Dr. Mesfin Gebremichael may hope to join us online, but I'm not sure that he's going to be able to make it. The connections haven't been great in Addis, and he's been on Skype with his university institute most of the day. And on the right, in the other blue shirt, is Tsagai Berhanu, who was a wonderful research assistant to us in the field when we looked at the communities on the northern bank of the Nile. So this gives a little clearer idea of where we went and what we did in relation to the resettlement sites. The black dots are the very approximate locations of the resettlement sites, and I stress that they really are very approximate. This has gone through 2 or 3 iterations of sketch maps and is the best that we could come up with, but we're not saying anything really very specific, not claiming anything about exactly where these dots really should be, really are in relation to where the GERD reservoir borders will end up. So we travelled along the yellow road going west-east from Asosa, passing through Awel Begu and on towards the bridge over the Nile. You'll see on this map we've left in the location of the existing river in dark blue, and the pale blue is the area that will be flooded. And then, so crossing from the Asosa zone side and Kamashi zone side onto the Metakal side, which is to the north and the east of the river on this map. We had meetings in Bahar Dar and Asosa, and then we drove straight through from Asosa to Mankush town at the top of your map, the white square, which is the Warada Center for Guba Warada. I should say that we had hoped to do a much more significant study of the resettlement sites, but as you may remember, those of you who are familiar with Ethiopia, this was not a very stable period. The middle of 2018 through to the beginning of 2019 was really a lot of conflict between the Gumas and their neighbors, both on the Amhara side, but particularly on the Oromo side. And as a consequence, we decided that we were advised to postpone the work several times, and in the end worked exclusively on the Metakal side of the river because of security considerations. So we looked at Yerenja village, which is one of the villages just beyond where the road, the yellow road, crosses the dark blue river. and is one of the villages where people are very reluctant to move. They're supposed to go right up to Yabulu, further up on your map. And we also went to Babizenda Kabele, which is part of what's known as Mankush Magentia, as far as I can understand. Again, it's very difficult to match up the sketch maps and the list of resettlement sites from our experience on the ground, but so lots of caveats there. We then travelled down the Little White, which is a non-asphalt road through Hajiko Magentia to Kong Centre, which is the only one of the 5 resettlement sites in Wambara Woreda which is accessible by vehicle. The others are almost impossible to access, even for those who are trying to bring in materials to build new facilities. And then we travelled up into that purple highland mountainous area up to Debrecen, which is the Wambara Woreda capital, and back down again, several trips down to Kong in order to talk to resettlers from Jadia and Jamare Kabeles. So that's us and our research. Those of you who are familiar with Ethiopia will know that it has a rather unhappy history of resettlement, particularly since the early 1980s, when it was the subject of a large-scale social engineering program of villagization and resettlement during the Marxist military Derg regime. It's been described as a sort of high modernist archetype, the archetypal Jim Scott seeing like a state, top-down, massive, and in many instances involuntary. It was then a surprise to many people that in 2003, the EPRDF government, under the federal arrangement, also launched a big resettlement program. So moving people within the 4 large highland national regional states from what they considered to be less productive to more fertile areas. And these 2 phases of resettlement between them moved more than 1.2 million people, according to Journia, who's quoted in Alula and François Piguet's book. But since then, there are 2 other kinds of resettlement that have been ongoing. One is the commune program, so-called, which is a program of villagization for better service delivery in lowland regions, Somali, Afar, Gambela, and Benishangul Gumuz. So it's important to bear in mind that this GERD resettlement is going ahead in the backdrop of resettlement or commune program being run by the Benishangul Gumuz regional government. So for instance, in Wambara Woreda, you have both programs coexisting. And then from 2004 to date, this is something which has been looked at particularly in the Ethiopia-wide longitudinal research on Ethiopian villages, which you can see by looking at this web link, which I've given. There's been a really widespread process of displacement and relocation in the face of new infrastructure investment and urban sprawl. So there's an issue, I think, about what kind of lesson learning has Ethiopia done, and can Ethiopia do better from this vast and not terribly happy history? This is Yorenja village, which is really quite an idyllic spot just above the bridge across the Blue Nile in Guba Woreda. It really is a location at the margin. Yorenja was established initially as a refugee camp for refugees coming across from Blue Nile and Upper Nile in Sudan. And it's really a kind of a wonderful spot just above and overlooking the river, from which one gets cool air, with a lot of trees, many of which have now been cut down. But this is really an indication of just how much at the margins of the Ethiopian state, probably closer connections into Sudan here than there are into Ethiopia and the Highland Centre. Looking at the Gumuz, we've benefited from this wonderful collection of ethnographic resources, and I should stress I'm not an anthropologist or an ethnographer. I tend to be more interested in government structures and systems, and that was initially what we thought we would be looking at on this project. But perhaps because of some of the sensitivities associated with GERD and some of the political transition going on in Ethiopia at the time, in the event we elected to focus more on the situation on the ground. So it was a stretch, and I think we learned a lot, and I hope that's reflected, particularly some of these volumes. And I would draw attention to the wonderful collection on moving people in Ethiopia that Alula and Francois Piguet put together, but also the unpublished PhD of Berihun Mabrati, which is really a wonderful resource on the Gumuz. So quickly summarizing, I mean, the Gumuz have a fearsome reputation. They're seen as primitive, barbaric, all the dreadful tropes and stereotypes which are bandied about. But I think it's really important in trying to understand what their experience of this contemporary state project is, to understand just how long and how brutal the history of relations with the state and with state actors have been. A long history of slaving in the region, going right through until the 1970s, as far as we can understand, on both banks of the Blue Nile, but particularly brutal going into the slaving markets into Gojam. It's also important to remember that the creation of Benishangul Gumuz as one of the federated states after 1991 under the Ethiopian Federation was both contested and conflictual, and that some of that contestation and conflict has recurred in 2018 and 2019 with an intensification of politicization of, let's call them, ethnic identities, nationality identities. I think it's important to note that both Wolaga and Gojam were historically well-established and well-entrenched entities, administrative entities, but also very, very important identities, both cultural, social, as well as political. So it was complicated creating the Benishangul Gumuz out of areas of these pre-existing areas. And it's important to remember also that, as John Young noted, Benishangul Gumuz had in 1991 suffered more from warfare than any other part of Ethiopia, with the possible exception of Tigray. It really had been through a dreadful period with this cycle of my enemy's enemy is my friend through the 1980s and early 90s between Ethiopia and Sudan. Also important to remember that the retreat to the riverbanks was a long-standing coping mechanism in the face of highland incursions, particularly agriculturalists moving into what they saw as empty land, under-occupied land. And that this long-standing coping mechanism of moving down into these sort of very inhospitable, very, very hot, arid areas along the riverbank is something which is the sort of, you know, your back door, your safe space, in a sense, is being closed off by the creation of the reservoir, or maybe, we don't yet know what will happen. So this means that this project has a particularly important need for federal sensitivity and inclusion and inclusiveness. So just looking at the GERD resettlement plan, this is a joint plan which is undertaken both by the government of Benishangul Gumuz, national, regional, state, and by the federal GERD project office, as all of these big infrastructures which cross more than one, dealing with rivers that cross more than one state boundary. This is a federal project, and the project office reports to the Deputy Prime Minister, Damaka Makonnen. The idea is to resettle 5,391 households, which is around about 20,000 people. So it's substantive, but it's quite spread out. This is a fairly sparsely populated area. The federal project and budget are under the Ethiopian Electric Power Corporation, commonly referred to as ELPA, its old acronym locally, and everybody, I think, sees that this that ELPA and the project is something which is managed in Addis Ababa, it's something that's done elsewhere. That project has supplied 815 million birr to the Benishangul Gumuz regional government for capital expenditure, and there is a projected 890 million birr available for livelihoods development, which hadn't yet been dispersed at the time of our research in late 2018 and January 2019. In the region, the committee is led by the president, and there's a technical committee which is led by the Bureau of Agriculture and Natural Resource head. And there's a kind of secretariat or coordination unit provided by the Food Security Coordination Unit of that bureau. Implementation started as early as 2013-14, so it's been going quite a long time now. And I think at that time people thought that the river would have risen and the dam would have been, the reservoir would have been filled by now, but we know events have intervened. In 2019, beginning of 2019, 14 out of the 17 resettlement centres had been established. So our first set of findings relate to the access to resources and services which are enjoyed by the 20,000 projected settlers. And this picture, I think, kind of sums up an awful lot about what's happened and what's been positive, but also what's maybe been problematic with the delivery of services. These kinds of buildings are very familiar from the Highlands. These are a standard format issue of new offices, schools, health posts, and these ones are pictured at Kong Resettlement Centre, which is in Wambara Warada, and the only one which is accessible by road. These kinds of buildings, as you can imagine, are going to be very, very difficult to construct in the other resettlement centres which are not accessible by vehicle. How on earth do you get these kind of concrete and so on in? They're also fiendishly hot. We tried to do interviews sitting in some of these buildings. They're like furnaces. It's 40 degrees plus in this area, even in January. So I think there's some concerns about whether they're the most suitable kind of investment to have made. And as with many resettlement sites, it's very easy to do the physical investment. It's much, much more difficult to do the human investment and to think more sensitively about what could be the social and cultural impact and the real needs in terms of service delivery, rather than using a sort of identikit formula from the Highlands. So they're very smart new facilities, but they're located in the new settlement sites, and services have been withdrawn in the old villages. So for instance, for those who've refused to move from their villages along the river to the new sites, they're no longer able to get education for their kids. And that's gone on now for several years. Many buildings are empty, particularly we were told grinding mills are empty. And they're in buildings which are, as you can see, fenced off, not terribly accessible to the community. Many sites have been relocated along main roads, which are easier to deliver services to and easier to establish for the authorities, but they're an awful long way from the river. And even in Guba Warada, where the power lines pass overhead, there's no electricity. You'll notice in this picture, there's solar power has been installed on one of the buildings, but we were told that it wasn't yet in use. However, and this is a very, very big however, and if it's the one single most important policy lesson I would like people to take away from our work and this presentation, there is an enormous issue of access to water in the new sites. And this is particularly problematic for people who are used to living along the riverbank and who are used to a livelihood that reflects that. Benishangul Gumuz has good perennial surface water, a number of rivers, the Bulus, the Blue Nile itself, and a number of other tributaries, but it's notoriously difficult to obtain groundwater easily. And this has been a problem which has been confronted absolutely everywhere in this resettlement program. Multiple boreholes which have been drilled have failed, or they've had to be drilled much deeper and the budget has been consumed. And we were told bluntly, don't come back until this problem is sorted out. Drinking water for humans, for animals, in all of the sites that we visited, but we were told in many others as well, is really a crisis. And in a sense, people are returning home. or families had taken a decision to split, half of the families staying in the resettlement sites and the other half staying back at the river with animals and so on. So there's also a wider social and cultural impact of living by the river. Somebody hasn't turned their microphone off, so if you could do that, that would be great. This is a very strong part of the identity of those who are operating in and living traditionally alongside the river, and a huge source of anxiety to them. This is the bridge, the existing bridge, which was built in 2007-8 across the Blue Nile, and which will be submerged. It's indicated on the red triangle. And this is the Belus River, which is slightly further to the east, where the road that we took to go up to the resettlement sites crosses the river. It's not absolutely clear whether or not this crossing will still be viable, but it's clear that there will need to be a new road built at the minimum. This is a new market area established in Gubaward at Babizenda. It's on an existing road, but it's very far from the river, and there's no water supply or electricity. And I have to say, there was an interesting research methodology lesson about, how can I say, the perils of doing research on a Saturday afternoon after market. We encountered very, very angry communities, not least, I think, fueled by a degree of alcohol that had been consumed. But some of the tropes that we know from other parts of the world about people being resettled into modern locations, and the problems of alcohol and exposure to alcohol as new with that exposure, I would say are quite problematic in this instance. So apart from the access to resources, there are some issues about land, property and compensation. Now, on the face of it, there's no shortage of new land, and none of the new settlers felt that they'd had any difficulty in being given new land. However, I think there's a very, very big caveat here, and this is something which we really feel policymakers need to do more research on. The existing land holding system amongst the Gumwas is basically invisible to outsiders, and would be invisible to anybody but a kind of thoroughgoing ethnographer who spent a long time there, or the community members themselves. And this is not something which has been explored by the Gerd Resettlement Project. And I think that has some implications for the future. We don't know how that's going to work out. The immediate issue and the immediate source of a lot of indignation and frustration amongst those we talked to, the very high expectations they had about property compensation. So unlike the commune programme, where people are being resettled and given new land but no compensation, this project is compensating people for what they've lost. And there was a very comprehensive audit of assets which was carried out in 2013 and 2014, and that, as you can imagine, raised expectations, counting every mango tree, every palm tree, every animal, as well as all the houses, the land and so on. And that people expected that they were going to have several 100,000 Ethiopian birr in compensation. But the payout hasn't usually been much more than about 40, 50,000. And most of that has been eaten up by new housing. There's a problem with compensation which was not paid to young people who don't have their own households, and this is really creating quite a serious problem. And it's something which, in a sense, is a lesson that should have been learnt from previous resettlement programs, so admirably documented in Alula and Francois' book. I think there is a lot of indignation that the compensation, these are significant amounts of money, particularly in that part of the country, have been paid into bank accounts rather than in cash. And these bank accounts are often very far away. The nearest bank branches are usually in the Warada centres, and in Mankush, the Guba Warada, it's even further away than that. The other source of indignation is that these bank accounts have been directly levied to give compensation directly for Highland construction companies who've been building new residential units. And there's a lot of disgruntlement about the quality of those units and the fact that it would have been much better, much cheaper if people had been allowed to build their own houses. Here is one of the bank books that we looked at, and this one is stamped with Wombera Warada official stamps as a verification of the identification of those to whom they own, to whom they belong. But there are an awful lot of gender issues associated with this, and I think this is, again, is an entirely predictable lesson from elsewhere. We found when we asked if we could see some of the titles to houses and bank savings books for the compensation accounts, they were always in the possession of men. There is a very important issue here about polygamy and the rights of women. In the instance on the right, you can see that the woman's photograph is included, but it's not always the case. And we heard of many instances where young people and women were not included. And of course, the definition of young person is very important, because if you were considered to be young in 2013, your circumstances may well have changed by 2020. This is just to indicate how far away the bank account could be. This is the road from Kong going east towards Debrecen, which is at the top of this mountain range. And the Wombera Warada main town and nearest bank branch is around 1,000 meters higher than the resettlement sites. People said that it was costing them several thousand birr just to be able to go make a complaint or access the bank account or speak to the Warada administrators about any grievances that they had. It's another picture showing just how far the distance up into the mountains behind is. And this is Dr. Musfin and it's a guy interviewing a compensation committee members. And again, you can see they're all male, those who were responsible for doing the audit of who got what and how that should be organised. So what's been established is a mixture of traditional round tukals and new square modern huts with corrugated metal roofs. And as I said, there's some concern about whether or not they're suited to the climate. But even if they're suited to the climate, the way they're being built, poorly built, unfinished, collapsing, maybe not the most appropriate technology, very expensive, people being charged 35,000, 40,000 birr for something which they didn't think was worth it, was very problematic. Real problems in terms of ownership and accountability here. This is a picture of another interview we had with a different committee, and this time in a beautifully cool traditional tukul used by the Kabele as its office, which was, showed me, certainly, I was extremely hot at this point, the benefits of these old traditional styles of architecture over the supposedly modern services being provided. Our third finding, let me try to speed up a bit, is that there is a problem with conceptualization of new livelihoods. People have moved, even in some cases up to 6 or 7 years ago, but that livelihood support hasn't yet been dispersed. And there are a lot of assumptions about what the Gumas will do in future, that they'll continue with hoe agriculture. And it's not clear that hoe agriculture is really the be-all and end-all of the Gumas livelihood system. And it's a very sophisticated mix of strategies: flood retreat agriculture, fishing, alluvial gold panning, which I think is something that the loss of which people are very concerned about, all of which may well be threatened. We don't know. And certainly the communities don't know. There are also a lot of assumptions about the advantages that they'll get from access to modern infrastructure, roads and river transportation. This is going to create a lake of several hundred kilometers length. fisheries and tourism development, but an awful lot of anxiety locally about who's really going to benefit from this and how will they benefit. One of the interesting things we found, and this again is on the Asosa side of the river before you cross the bridge, is that there's been tree cutting going on several times over now for several years on the basis that trees need to be felled before the reservoir is flooded so that they don't block up the dam, they don't silt up the dam and create problems with the turbines. So this is quite an interesting visible marker for local communities. And they're starting to say, well, if they only cut the trees here, why are we being resettled so far? Who's going to get access to our riverbank land? And this is a huge source of anxiety in an area which has also seen 1 or 2 agricultural investors move in, who've also been compensated for a loss of land. A fourth finding is about the risks to community cohesion and articulation. And I think this is something, again, which could bear an awful lot more ethnographic work going forward. These are communities which were used to be living apart, and now they've been relocated into close proximity with one another in many cases. And many officials said, look, this is really very stressful for us. We're having to do an awful lot of work to assure that communities can get on with one another because they're not used to living on top of one another. And this, I think, is further compounded by the lack of understanding I mentioned already about land use and land rights amongst the Gumuz. Very little is understood about the relationship between territory, clan, and individual amongst the riverine Gumuz. And this is not something which an environmental and social assessment has been able to assess insofar as we have been able to establish. Berihun Murati put it beautifully when he said that the concept of the peasant association is not an indigenous form of organization. There are many more clans amongst the Gumuz than there are villages or kabeles, and I don't think it's been possible to take these issues into consideration in the resettlement. And of course, there's also the question of how this has an impact in terms of gender. I don't go into it here, but Meron Zaleke's book on women and gender amongst the Gumuz is a very, very interesting read. And talks indeed about the importance of the river as a symbolic place for childbirth and for the importance of the river in bringing up children. So one can see why this community at Yarenja is so reluctant to move from a really rather idyllic location that it has at the moment. A lot of trees, you can see these palm trees low down in the front of this picture. In fact, when I first visited this area back in 2006, just before the bridge was completed, this was a forest of palm trees. It was an absolutely idyllic location. So one can see already things have been lost, and it's not clear that this rather arid, dusty, new settlement sites with no water on the main roads are going to be a solution for these communities. It's very intelligible why they would be reluctant to move. Last set of findings, and in a sense this is what's most interesting for me as a political scientist, is around sequencing planning and the local credibility of the resettlement project. We saw a lot of instances of confusion of timing and sequencing and poor communication on the part of different government actors. As you know, local government and regional government spokespersons were very honest. They said, how are we supposed to explain to the population in that area what it means for the river to rise, as the government is telling us it will, when even we find it hard to imagine what this actually means in practice? And it's sort of being there and inhabiting this space physically just for a few days. It really brought home just how big a leap of imagination this is going to need. And I think there was something changed slightly last summer, the summer but rainy season before one, when actually because of the way the dam construction was progressing, there was a bit of a shift in terms of the river level. And then people started to think, aha, okay, they weren't just joking with us. There is something really at stake. Incidentally, the phrase "Mangistya Chawata Bernal," the government is joking on us or playing with us, was one that we heard very frequently when we were down in that area. Palm trees are being cut 3 times over because things have taken so long, and there's a lot of disgruntlement about who's controlled those resources, what's happened to them, why they couldn't have stayed until the river really was going to rise. And I think it's clear that the problems of this program have been associated partly with the remote locations, but also with the multiple stakeholders who've been involved in it, given the federal multi-level governance associated with this. I think we felt that there really is inadequate local and also national, regional, state ownership of the decision making over this. And it's not unreasonable to feel that federal government wants to pull the levers, but I think trying to take institutional steps, which would mean that local decision makers are more closely involved, would be desirable. Decisions are taken very far away, even within the Worridah level. The Worridah town is a long way away in some instances. And very, very weak institutionalization of local government and zonal structures within Beni Shengul Gumuz doesn't help. So there are a lot of questions about how to ensure that local communities benefit. I wanted to show you this other photograph just to show how very different things look from Wombera Worridah Center, which is at 1,000 meters higher on the escarpment than the 5 resettlement sites that this Worridah is seeking to support. And I think it's a really good instance of how Worridahs are not units, they're very diverse. And in particular, I think Wombera Worridah faces a lot of logistical issues. So in conclusion, I don't seek to answer any of these questions, and I hope we can discuss some of them more. There are a lot of questions about ensuring that the riverine Gumuz share in the benefits that will be generated by the GERD. And it's not all negative. We met many people who are proud of the fact that they understand the national significance in the national economic transformation of Ethiopia's Renaissance Dam. But they want to understand more clearly how they're going to be able to share in the benefits, as well as being proud of the fact that it's something which is being done in their region. I think there are very serious questions about how to identify better what it is that local communities want from the dam and the reservoir, and how to establish a better understanding of what they may already be losing. And I'm thinking particularly of the intangible things that they're losing. And access to the river edge or the lake edge, I think is a very complicated one, and something which hasn't been communicated clearly, perhaps because it's very unclear how this is going to work. We don't know. We know that there are a lot of discussions about the filling of the dam and what the downstream impact would be. We need also to have a discussion about the upstream impact of filling the dam and whether this is a lake which is going to rise and fall on a regular basis, and if so, how, and what does that mean for local livelihoods. There's questions about how to bring the Ethiopian Electric Power Authority and the Abai Basin Authority based in Bahir Dar closer to the Gumuz. I suspect that Zoom conference calls are a little way away still, but one would like to see some more creative thinking about how one could engage local people in the longer term in this, in the ownership of this project. There's questions about who should be designing a strategic economic development plan for these parts of Beni Shengul Gumuz and how should they do it. It's clear from conversations in Asosa that this is something that they want to do and they see the need that they should do it, but they don't yet have the capability to think about this. Whether it's livelihoods or education or mobility, this is going to change this region very dramatically, and the regional government, I think, needs some support in figuring out how to make sure that its communities see benefits. There's some very, very important questions to be asked about revenue sharing and the funding of local development. there are good models, and I think if Jamie is online, he can share his experiences of what's been done elsewhere. We think these should be explored in the Ethiopian case now by policymakers. And we also want to raise questions about whether Ethiopia is really learning the lessons it could be learning, not just internationally, but from its very, very rich and extensive domestic knowledge of resettlement. This is not new in Ethiopia, and I think a slightly more clear-sighted, less politicized, less anxious, more developmental, if you like, consideration of the resettlement lessons that could be learned would be really important for this community of Gomos also. So I will leave it at that point, and I will go back to Rose and Roshan to open up for questions.
Thanks, Eric. That was really interesting. A lot of participants here, so I'm trying to figure out the best way to do questions. I'm going to open up the chat room. We'd like, if you could use the Zoom's raise hand feature. If you hover over your screen, you'll be able to see that. And would like you to interact with her as much as possible, but there's also a lot of us. So if you could type your question in this big chat room, even better. That might save us some time. So let's open it up to questions. And that's the chat room. If you should have gotten the message right there. Yeah.
Wow, can I just say how great it is? Now I can see who's online to see how many Ethiopians there are. And I hope I haven't trodden on too many toes, but Christopher Clapham once said you can't talk about Ethiopia without treading on somebody's toes. And I think he often did it without treading on everybody's toes. So I'll be in good company if I have.
But anyone want to get started with the Q&A? Amy's raised his hand. Yes, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for, sorry, just clicking the buttons. Thanks very much, Sarah, for a very interesting talk. And I think you've put your finger on a whole range of issues that many of us involved in resettlement in hydropower schemes would recognize from elsewhere. I just wanted to follow up on your comment about benefit sharing and reallocation of resources from hydropower revenues, because there is absolutely no reason why central government can't require a transfer of resources from hydropower or revenues from hydropower generated to normally local government, sometimes specially set up funds for communities. But I guess in the case of Ethiopia, it would be local government, to allow them to have an annual revenue stream to invest in rebuilding livelihoods of affected people throughout the life of the dam. So over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there would be a revenue stream that helped those communities to re-establish their livelihoods and their community functions. The challenge often with these is that they're hard to do in a site-specific kind of way, because national policy tends to apply to all infrastructure in the country. And where we've tried to do it, for example, in Niger, we ran into a challenge of, well, if we're going to do it for hydropower, why do we not do it for oil or coal extraction or uranium mining? The same in Guinea. You know, we're taxing this sector. Why are we not taxing the other sectors? Should we be doing it for wind? Should we be doing it for thermal plants? And so the discussion sort of spirals a little bit into a you know, one-size-fits-all government policy. Is this something we want to do for all dams in the country? Is it something we want to do for all energy generators? Is it something we want to apply more broadly about extractive industries? So I would just caution a little bit in the complexities of it, but I do think it is one of the tools for trying to internalize some of the negative externalities of large hydropower resettlement that is hard and challenging to do over a 4 or 5 year period, and where you do need to have investments over 10, 15, 20 years to re-establish livelihoods.
I completely agree, Jamie. And whilst Roshan's figuring out who to release next, maybe just comment. I think this is a really complicated issue, and it's one that needs a national discussion in Ethiopia. And in a sense, there is already some evidence of Ethiopia dealing with this on an ad hoc basis. Those of you who follow things closely will be aware that there's been a revenue sharing agreement about oil production in the Ogaden, which has been struck between Addis and Jijiga. And that's a really complicated precedent if this were to be applied. I mean, it would give a claim for Benishangul Gumuz National Regional State potentially to ask for 50% of the revenues of the dam. So I think some clearer thinking needs to go on so that this is dealt with in a developmental and constructive way, exactly on the basis and looking at exactly the complications that you have mentioned, in order to make sure that this becomes something which is nationally positive and you get an equitable sharing of resources, which supports a very, very marginalized local community, but also supports the national economic transformation as the architects of the dam first envisaged.
Sarah, are you able to access the chat function? Or I guess I could call on, there's not been that many questions. Catherine, would you like to go next with your question?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but it's building on Jamie's point and on what you just said, Sarah. I think there's also, thinking about funds flows that would go to these local communities based on the fact that something is taken from them. But it's true too for other things that are being taken from other communities, and the whole thing plays into how you look into equity issues in consideration to all of the resource flows. That's one. And the other one is also just in terms of management of the flow of these additional flows of funds. I've seen cases in South Sudan where basically it was catastrophically parallel to existing accountability mechanisms and so on, and really accountability planning, monitoring, everything in ways which were pretty catastrophic. So there are many issues with that, not that they shouldn't be addressed, but it's a very complicated area. Lots of thinking.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, I mean, I'm just reading Barnaby's comments. Can everybody see the chat, Roshan?
I hope so.
Okay, so well, he's saying that, it's a remarkable case of lack of learning. Why is it that there isn't more learning about equity and so on? I mean, I think that one of the problems is this real sense of how can I put it, isolation and threat that Ethiopia feels over its dams and hydropower policy. I mean, we found it really important to try to avoid politicizing this. We've reached some critical conclusions, and I hope we've fairly presented the views of the communities that we talk to, but we didn't want to end up in a kind of adversarial thing. I mean, there's been a very, very adversarial dialogue around the rights of indigenous communities and them being trampled on, and the developmental state, really destroying communities. Now, that's one set of issues, and I don't want to undermine it. It's very important. But our interest here was to say, okay, we are where we are, but so how do we get policymakers to think more creatively about going forward in a positive way? And I think, Barnaby saying it's remarkable that there's not more learning going on. And I think that's partly because of this anxiety about the resettlement past, and the resettlement which is ongoing. I mean, it's very much associated with, let's face it, the bedrock of Ethiopian politics is the land issue, and having land in public ownership, which is not something which I'm against necessarily, but it needs, as Catherine said, it needs really, really good management of resources associated with that. It needs a really good administrative system, and I think there've got to be some questions in place about that. And the whole issue of wider compensation for people being displaced from every Warada town, every Kebele centre is expanding, and so many people are being relocated and dislocated across the country. So it's a much wider developmental discourse, I think. But maybe it's kind of sensitive because of the sensitivities associated with the dam at the national level, and this sense of kind of encirclement that nobody would support us with the dam. This was something that needed to be done with national resources, and that we're being attacked by Egypt and elsewhere and so on. So I don't know if that's part of an answer to your question, Barnaby. Do you want to take some more questions? It's quite hard reading the chat and talking.
It is, yeah. Barnaby, was the question answered, or you'd like to follow up? It's up to you. Is Barnaby here? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Let's move on to Stu, I believe was next.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question with regards to the communication and the unique way in which this dam has been financed, with all sorts of promotional activities to crowdsource, bonds, lotteries, and these sort of things. I was wondering if the communities near the dam site had also been approached to join in these financing schemes. And how do you think this non-traditional way of financing a dam, for example, lack of international financial institutions, has affected the disbursement of money and the situation on the ground? That's my first question. And then the second one is related to a buffer for malaria control around the reservoir. There was reporting in 2015 that to avoid some of the WHO concerns around reservoirs and malaria, that they would put in a 5-kilometer buffer zone. Did that at all come up in conversations? Because that would seem quite a critical piece of policy if people are not having access to water.
Yeah, I mean, no, the local communities are not financing GERD bonds. I mean, the local communities barely deal in cash. These are really very, very distant places. I mean, even to get to a bank account is new for them, and it's far for them. So no, they haven't been involved in the financing. They are at the Kebele level and the Warada level, they're aware of the way it's being financed. But no, they're not, they're not integrated into the formal financial sector. It may be that some civil servants have contributed a month of salaries, as many people have. Whether that financing mechanism has affected the disbursement of the project, it's not clear to me. I mean, to be honest, I think I've talked about some of the problems which the communities see associated with this project, but in comparison with some other resettlement projects, in terms of budgeting for this kind of support, whether it's new infrastructure or new livelihood support, there hasn't been a problem of the federal government allocating the budget. I think they've bent over backwards to make sure they did this, because it's really important in terms of of the credibility and the reputation of this hugely important national project, that it should be adequately financed. I think there are more issues to do with the chain of command is too far away, if you like. You know, this is something which is controlled by EEP. And as we know, there have been some issues associated with corruption in relation to EEP. So, you know, there's a kind of sense of suspicion. Is there a problem here? What's really going on? But I don't think one can argue that the fact that Ethiopia has raised this revenue domestically means that there is less money which is going for these kinds of resettlement programs. In fact, I would say it's probably more conscious of its obligations. The problem is that its obligations are being met in a rather formulaic and top-down way. I think that would be my response. And on malaria control, no, we didn't hear anything about this. Though malaria drugs were one of the very few drugs that we saw evidence that there were actually 1 or 2 health posts that did have this kind of medication. I don't know if that covers your points.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, Brooke, that's a nice comment, Brooke. Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, it was quite a scary time to be doing this research. There was an awful lot going on down there. This was a research time that was after the change of government in April 2018. And Brooke's asking, to what extent has there been a turnover of people engaged in the GERD office or the Gumuz administration for that matter? How has the resettlement program evolved over time? New regime, new actors, new learning. There wasn't any evidence of new people in place when we were there. I think there have been a few changes in the Benishangul Gumuz regional government, but they're very few. There was, if you like, there was cynicism about some of the other changes that have taken place amongst the GERD contractors and the EEP and so on locally, but we didn't see a change of local personnel at this stage. In fact, I would say I'm a fan of the Benishangul Gumuz regional government. I think they've got a really bad hand and they're playing it as well as they possibly can. And, you know, they've had huge problems of conflict on their borders in the last couple of years. And there are some very sensible, very committed, great people who are really trying to do the best job they possibly can, but with incredibly difficult resources and incredibly complicated logistics. You know, just getting phone lines to Warada capitals, let alone Kabeles, is really difficult. And driving some of these roads, I mean, it's, you know, these are hundreds of miles to get from Zam capital to Wardas, let alone to Kabeles. Okay, who's next?
I think the next one was Alula. Saying that right?
Hi, can you hear me? Let me see if I can put on the video.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Hi.
can.
Hi, Sarah.
Great. Hi, and no, it's very scary talking, knowing that you were somewhere in the ether.
It's really great. I think you've identified the key issues of the access to the river area, the land issues and the water and the livelihoods and natural resources. Those obviously are initially the most important things. And, you know, that, as you were saying, there's quite a history of looking at the resettlement, in particular the Gumuz, with the work of Gabriel Walda Selassie in the Derg period. But even under the EPRDF, the work of Kasahun on Gilgal Gibe, and more recently I examined the thesis of Edegeling on Gilgal Gibe 3. And I think you would find that this was only in November. And I think you'd find a lot of parallels, in particular with the relationship with the Electric Power Authority, with what you were explaining. I think the question that then emerges after that is whether, there is changes in livelihood and some people benefiting, and whether you mentioned the gender differences, are there also age differences? Are there people who potentially might benefit from being closer to roads? And the sort of history of looking at dam resettlement, right from the Kariba Dam and the longitudinal studies of Colson and Scudder, suggests that in the end, it's not actually the fact that people are resettled from a dam that matters most, but more whether they become more integrated into the regional economy. Now, obviously, for people whose livelihoods have been very much, involved in Sweden agriculture and not linked into the national economy, the question is this brutal rapid change something that they're going to deal with, or is it something they will completely reject? Or do you have some people, maybe some younger youth going to school, who might end up, actually taking advantage of this? I recall that when my sister looked at a villagization place during the Derg, Helen found that nobody wanted to live in the villages initially, but then later some people began to see advantages in it. And then the kind of shifting between one where you used to be and where you are now, if you can move back and forth. And I wondered to what extent you think that a snapshot of what it's like now, whether you anticipate that 5 years down the line, things will look different for some people. Are some people going to see this as a resource, or is it going to be completely abandoned?
These are all really, really good questions, and I don't think we have the answer. And as you say, it was just a snapshot. I would love to have the opportunity to go back kind of almost annually or every 18 months between, over the period and look at the impact of the filling at different stages, because I think it's really, it's very clear that if nothing else, that the level of the water is going to make a huge difference in terms of whether or not they're close to it and whether or not some of those pre-existing livelihood systems will be able to continue or not. So I think, but at the moment it's almost like everything's in a state of limbo. You've got people are, they've moved, and in some cases they've split their activities, so they've left people. Sometimes it's young people have been left with animals by the water, and others have moved. Women have moved because they're supposed to be health services, though I think things like grinding mills, health services, maternal health services are really problematic in the resettlement sites and non-existent in the old villages. They've cut all of that service delivery. But there's also an issue about leaving young people closer to the river, because then they can't be in education, and there's still quite a lot of pressure for people to put their children into education. So in some places it's younger children will move to the resettlement sites where they can have some education, but then older people will stay behind. But as you say, this is a transitional period, and it will probably change, assuming that there is an agreement and or Ethiopia just decides how it's going to fill the dam. This is going to start to happen, we understand, fairly imminently. And I think the question about that other set of options that you raised about becoming more linked into a more regional economy is still really, I don't see a debate going on about how that might happen and what those opportunities might be. And I think the regional government is scared of what the implications could be, to be honest. They need help, they need support to work on these things. And of course, everybody's terminally distracted by other things at the moment, not least of which the reason we're doing this electronically rather than face to face. But I think there is a real concern that, these are communities which have begun to learn to live on safety net in some instances, and that this process of resettlement, because the sequencing hasn't been as great as it could have been, or it's, the communication's been slow, things happened very early on, but then the river didn't rise, because it's been all a bit kind of rough and ready. And of course, this huge problem of water supply in the new sites, that actually the outcome of just not being able to deal with it and kind of further impoverishment is is quite a real one, I think. So I don't think we know. I think it needs more research, and I think it would be great if it could just be, you know, seen as a sensible part of social studies about what's going on and the process of change in the country, and not seen as something which is, oh, we can't talk about that because it's far too, you know, problematic and it would give the GERD a bad name and so on. So I would love to see exactly these questions opened up. I don't think we know enough on the basis of our very short dip into the water, if you like, which different groups might benefit differently. But it's very clear that there are different generations and they've got different perspectives on this, and that's something we could draw a little bit more out of the data that we do have. Yeah, but what the new economy that they could become linked into is going to be, nobody knows. You know, there's a lot of talk about tourism and river transport, boat transport, but a lot of suspicion that, oh, well, it'll just be investors will come in and take up all the nice new land. I mean, the other interesting PhD on this area recently, I think, is Mehdi's, which has looked at some of these issues. So I think there's grounds to be concerned, as well as grounds to see that there are lots of viable options that could be developed. And I also think there could be some learning from some of the positive experiences. I mean, I think the Tekeze Dam is one which is really quite, seems on the face of it to be working relatively well in terms of empowering communities on its banks, but that's a very, very different sociological and political context, of course. I've got M. Gabriels was the next on the list.
There's some...
Yeah, well, mine may not be strictly a question, but one observation I had, we had a paper to write, and I was really astonished that there are only very, very few empirical works. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Oh, we could hear you. I'm not sure we can hear you now. Okay, so maybe I can read the comment, which is that we just got a paper accepted on Cambridge Journal of Regions on a similar issue, but with a focus on risk perception and management point of view, which we've called Riskscapes. Made similar conclusions to yours. The major argument we put through is that local communities are particularly suffering from the near exclusive focus of the debate on GERD and its transboundary dimension, did not get the kind of national and international attention. I completely agree. I couldn't agree more with you. I think that's absolutely the focus of what I've been trying to say. I'm not sure if there was something else that you wanted to add in your comments or questions. If not, maybe we go to Galaxy, is it?
Yeah, I think that's the device, Galaxy S8, whoever's on that, yeah.
We can't hear you, maybe you're muted.
I've just unmuted them. We can hear you now.
Hello, is it me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is Gideon from Addis.
Hi, Gideon. Nice to see you.
Gideon from Addis. Yes, Sarah, it was a very excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. Delighted that you could join.
Yeah, it's true that we've been focusing on the transboundary aspects. And I'm sure you have read the Resettlement Action Plan, the 2 volumes.
Mm-hmm.
Which has been done by a national consultant.
Yeah.
I think it was done in 2014 or so, the study. I mean, the plan is good. I've gone through some of these action plan studies. as far as the implementation goes, I think some of your findings, I know you posed them in a question manner, but there are
Gideon, you've dropped off at the critical moment when you're about to be critical, I think.
Yeah, I think we've lost them. As we wait for them, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anyone else? I don't see any raised hands. I'll give Gideon a minute or two. I think they've dropped that completely now. I'm sorry, there's a lot of screens to look through. Yeah, I think I don't think we are connected to them anymore.
Right, that's a shame. Really a shame we got cut off. From M. Gabriels, if I may put my points in terms of question, why do you think the social impacts of GERD were not given the same attention as, for example, that of Gibe 3 and the like? Well, I suspect Gideon was about to tell me that they have been given more attention than I have suggested. And Gideon, if you're hearing me, I would love to talk about this more at some point. We have seen some of the early volumes of the plans, but I think it would be really useful to understand a little bit more in detail exactly who in government is involved in this, because as you can imagine, it was a kind of sticky time to be researching this last year, and maybe things would get easier in some ways now. But I think it's got to be the case that one of the reasons that the social impacts of the GERD were not given quite so much consideration, or don't seem to have been given quite so much consideration, or quite such effective consideration, is the distance and the remoteness and the difficulty of getting to these places. I mean, I will put the working paper will go up before the end of April, so you'll be able to read that. And I would love to get more detailed comments and feedback then, because we'll be reworking this for an edited book project over the next couple of months. But I also think that it's really difficult to get to. If you look at the map of where these places are and how far they are from any kind of road, you know, I mean, as I said, 4 out of 5 of the resettlement sites in Wombera can't be accessed by vehicles. And they, you know, they sort of took one look at me and Deborah and laughed and said, well, you're not going to get there anytime soon. You know, you're not capable of walking in that heat. So it's really difficult. And I think that the same would be true of many Highlanders and many of the Highland construction companies, contractors who are involved in this. It's really difficult to work in that environment. It's really difficult to do research in that environment. And I have huge admiration for the people, including some of those that Alula has worked with and published and examined theses on recently, who've done work in these incredibly difficult areas, because it's, you know, it's one thing to visit for a few days and then go away and collapse, but really to work there for a long time. And I think there are very, very few NGOs working outside. The only evidence we saw of any external actors was a couple of Catholic nuns were down there and were very, very exercised by the water supply situation when we were there. So I think that was, yeah, that was also instructive. I mean, it's a difficult place to get to, and it's become even more difficult to get to because of conflicts which have continued on the border between Amhara and Benishangul Gumuz. You know, the killings in Jawi mean that it wouldn't be possible now to travel down from Chagni. I don't know the latest on the situation going to Asosa, but we know that Waleka has been in a very difficult situation over the last couple of months, and thank goodness the internet and phone network is back on there now. But this, I think there are good reasons why it's been very difficult to do this kind of work, but that doesn't mean to say that the work doesn't need to take place. I don't know if that answers your question.
With one last raised hand, this will be the last question. Running out of time. Hone, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Thanks so much for the presentation, sir. I just want to follow up on the idea you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, and also now, just a moment ago, about interethnic relationships. And I'm just curious to hear more about it, in case if you have found any way this interethnic relationship concern is featured in the way the local people see the selection of the dam sites, or the reimbursement is they got for the amount, or even with the regional officials kind of seeing the dam in relation to the broader Ethiopian state. Was there any way the interethnic relationship mentioned in relation to your research, and how do you, if you have any comment on that?
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's an honor to have you join us. I think this is very delicate terrain, obviously, and it's been a very delicate couple of years after a not straightforward couple of decades. I think it's true to say I've done a couple of pieces of research in Benishangul Gumuz since the change of government in April 2018, one looking at refugee camps down there. And it's clear to say that the regional government felt rather under siege, maybe. That's my interpretation. But I have to say I'm impressed with their commitment and their concern to try to focus on developmental issues. Now, it's clear that there have been politicians in that region and in neighboring regions who have played a role, I think, that, and we all know some instances who they are. But I also think it's really important. This is another set of reasons why it's so important that the federal government and the regional governments all work together as much as they possibly can, and why those federal institutions, the House of Federation, the standing committees, of really kind of focus on how to preempt problems and how to work so that this can be really fantastically positive outcomes. This is a hugely important project. It's the flagship project for Ethiopia, and I think all of us who care about Ethiopia hope that it will be successful and really can have a transformative effect, not just on the Ethiopian economy, but on the region. And that makes it even more important that, this kinds of intergovernmental relations. And we've heard a lot about intergovernmental relations since COVID-19 started globally. We're worried about intergovernmental relations in the UK, very not quite so united sometimes kingdom. We've heard about federal state relations in the US, the way it works in Germany, and of course, this is much to the fore when you have a kind of emergency campaign like we have against COVID-19. Federal regional relations become all the more important, and I know that a number of commentators, some really good federalism specialists, have started to comment on the situation in Ethiopia. So I'm somebody who always really hoped that federalism was going to be a solution for Ethiopia, and I still think it can be. And I think this is a very, very delicate moment, and it needs to be managed very carefully. And also that, in this particular project, as such an important project for the country, every opportunity, you know, at the Kibale level, at the Warada level, at the regional level, at the federal level, for, you know, bringing people together and improving their understanding of what other actors are doing. And that means really, really good communication strategies. I'd love to see a federal communications team that went down to these places every month and had meetings with people, and that it was a kind of ongoing process just to build confidence and to explore all those issues which Alila raised about how those communities can be integrated into the local, the wider economy as it develops. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think that's all we have. No, thank you so much, Sarah. If I miss any raised hands, I apologize for that. Hard to navigate this. A recording of this lecture will be made available on our website, futuredams.org, and you can also find our past lectures on that website, and I'm sure Sarah will be happy to answer any questions via email and other correspondence as well. We can't give you a round of applause virtually, but thank you so much, Sarah. This is very interesting. And
thank you for organizing this. I just have to say how much I've enjoyed working with Future Dams and with the University of Manchester and Tom Lavers in particular. So, you know, and I know that my colleague, Dr. Masfin Gabrimika, would have loved to have been able to be online and join us this afternoon, but you know, they were a great team to work with. And I really hope that we'll get the opportunity to have more discussions with policy makers and feed into the process and make sure that this research has a useful impact, and maybe that we can continue to look at regular intervals about how this situation hopefully gets better. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And yeah, we'll try and do another one of these in 3 weeks, about a month, and you can find all that info on our website again, futuredams.org.